Hi guys, welcome to Data Protection Made Easy podcast. This is season 2, episode 28, GDPR radio episode. I'm Amber, and today I'm joined by my colleague Mark, who's one of our senior data protection consultants. How did you find the session today?
I found it fascinating, to be honest. It's a shame that we didn't have more time there, because I think there were many more angles that we could have discussed.
Yeah, we had a lot to talk about. And we won't spoil it too much though, unless you have any highlights that you want to...
I'll just say that, this is a very, I'd say, broad and, it interlinks all the big themes, I think, around the data protection, cyber, privacy, AI, and so on. So I think we did a good job of kind of weaving all of those together into one podcast. So, yeah, I'll say enjoy.
Yeah, perfect. I'll let you guys listen.
Welcome along to this session of GDPR Radio. I'm Mark, and with me today I have Amber.
Hello.
So how has your week been?
Yeah, it's been good. Been pretty busy. Well, I suppose it's been a weekend, wasn't it? But last week was pretty busy. How's yours?
Yeah, no, it's been well, to be honest. Just, very, very busy, as always. So we've got quite a few interesting news stories from the past week or so to bring everyone up to speed with. I think the headline has to be the MOD data breach. There was a House of Commons report into this, and the big finding basically is that the breach, it could have been prevented if the MOD staff had received some basic Excel training. So quite a worrying revelation there, that such a bad breach, people even say potentially the worst data breach ever. We had the identities of these, I think it's at 18,000 or so kind of Afghan relocation applicants who were trying to escape the Taliban being leaked, ended up on the dark web, ended up in the hands of the Taliban themselves. And the fact that this could have been prevented, if staff just understood, basics of Excel.
Yeah, all because of a hidden cell as well, or a hidden sheet, was it?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe it was a hidden sheet. So that, is immediately concerning. Of course, there's all controversy around it, whereby there was a super injunction taken out to basically conceal the breach, in order that it could be remedied, I suppose.
Yeah.
And obviously the ICO declined or, decided not to investigate it thoroughly. And I think what was put forward by the MOD and what the ICO kind of concurred with was that, this was just like a human error, just a mistake, basically. I think this report kind of says otherwise, basically. But I think it goes back to what we discussed before on the podcast around training, doesn't it?
Yeah, because I think quite often when we look at training, we tend to look at the more technical errors that people might make, or the legal jargon side of things when it comes to GDPR and what the big sort of data protection issues are. But in reality, I think sometimes we overlook the most basic types of training. So just learning how to use Excel, which, I suppose we overestimate how many people are actually familiar with that sort of software. But I find it interesting that the ICO didn't really try to enforce one of the biggest principles, I would say, which is accountability, sort of just swept it under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at the time it was kind of done on the basis of that kind of public sector approach, which I believe is still an ongoing thing, to be fair. Well, it'd be interesting to see what the new Information Commission changes and keeps the same in that regard. But, just on the topic of public sector data breaches as well, but of a different nature. I mean, we can see that this one was, as we put it down to, a kind of error of basic training. I think for me, it kind of highlights how I think it's easy to take the kind of basics of, data protection training for granted.
Yeah.
As you kind of allude to there, we always think about breaches are probably due to, the people not having more specialized training perhaps, but obviously this case shows that basic training, it can avert disasters basically. But just on that public sector theme, I suppose, and theme of data breaches, we have obviously the breach of the Department for Education, whereby, I mean, this is different. In a sense, we've had, this hacking group, I believe, called Exfil Squad is the name they go by, launched a cyber attack basically against the Department for Education. They've managed to get hold of 607,000 lines of data, and that has been leaked onto the dark web. It was data that was, the attack was launched against the help desk portal. So I don't believe it's information of the most sensitive nature necessarily, but we do have lots of, contact details, and job roles and so on, belonging to people involved in the education sector. So, up to government officials, senior school leaders, university staff, also parents as well, that will have contacted the help desk. So again, just highlights that, cyber breaches again are happening on such frequent basis now.
Yeah, and particularly with sort of the rise of AI, it's being used a lot more to sort of facilitate these cyber attacks. So I think, again, it sort of links back to the whole training thing, in that a lot of time when you see a breach happens, you'd assume it's something catastrophic, something that'd be hard to sort of prevent, or we look towards the more sort of technical errors that are made. But in reality, sometimes it's just the most basic things that haven't been implemented. So running spear phishing attacks, for example, or running false ones, obviously, not real ones, to sort of train people on how to react in those instances, having sort of campaigns, raising awareness, or even sort of using AI in a way that sort of counteracts that. Because I think a lot of the time we use AI in so many different areas. I think we ought to be using it more to sort of prevent these types of breaches. Same when it comes to breaches where, an email's been sent to the wrong person.
Sure.
Sort of research shows that is the most common way for a breach to occur. And yet a lot of the time people don't have sort of automated processes in place to prevent that. Even without AI, that's something you can put in place to sort of double check. I know you were saying there's something that sort of double checks the metadata to see whether sort of content of an email matches the supposed recipient, which I think just needs to be implemented a lot more, like organization wide, to prevent such like easy sort of breaches from occurring.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think it does have the potential. I'm talking about even basic AI integrations here, where you can just kind of ask the question, what's wrong with this document? So, and I've had that where, it's pulled up very obvious things, but that which, us humans can easily overlook. So, the document metadata is showing, the name of, a certain company or a certain person and so on, which obviously is data you would want to, probably, remove, for example. Because I think with this breach, it was said that, or was remarked that I do believe AI has aided the attackers in this DFE breach. So, as you say, AI is going to be leveraged to launch cyber attacks. It also has to be leveraged to combat them at the same time. So it's kind of going to be used on both sides of the equation, isn't it?
Yeah, even sort of linking back to something me and Kane touched on last week was the whole Anthropic case where the system was in sort of the sandbox, it found vulnerability and it used that vulnerability to escape its own system. It's clear that AI is becoming significantly more clever. It's being used to assist with cyber attacks, to find vulnerabilities, to inject systems. And I think we just need to sort of really take that on board and use it to counteract it as well, because it's becoming a huge risk.
Yes, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because IBM actually published a report on the cost of the data breach for 2026, which basically found that the global average cost of a data breach has risen by 12% over the past year. So I think it's just shy of $5 million, basically. So yeah, again, a very significant number. But what I find interesting, to link back to what you've said there about AI, is that they have remarked that, a big driver in the cost increase is a 56% increase in AI-driven attacks, which is obviously allowing the cyber criminals to launch bigger attacks and, at greater speed as well.
Yeah, and it's so much cheaper for everyone if you just sort of anticipate that these are going to happen, that AI is going to increase the number of attacks and sort of the success of attacks, but also by using that money to put in preventative measures in place, because I think it's clear that, corrective measures are far more expensive, especially given sort of the current climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're talking about breaches here from, the point of view of cyber attackers and hackers and so on. But actually, with AI, that's not necessarily the only issue that's present. I think actually there was quite a worrying story that came out over that last kind of week or so around the Claude AI system, where basically it was discovered that a lot of private chats that users are having with Claude are actually publicly available due to the configuration of the settings. So we're talking again about what are valid issues and concerns around people hacking AI and so on, or even AI, as you've said, almost hacking itself in a way.
Yeah.
But with this, it's kind of like, you know, we're still not across all the basics, are we? We still haven't ensured that little glitches like this with privacy settings and so on are taken care of.
Yeah, to me, that story was very surprising. I think particularly because we talk a lot about privacy by design, privacy by default, and it seems as though in this case, the default setting was that chats were shared publicly, and the setting was already sort of pre-ticked to share publicly, which is not something you generally expect. And I think obviously a lot of the time when we talk about data protection rights, we do tend to look towards whether things are fair and whether they are reasonably expected. And for me personally, I don't know if you agree, Mark, but that's not something I'd reasonably expect.
Absolutely not. Yeah, that's exactly what I'd attribute it to be honest. And that, yeah, clearly, you know, the data protection by design approach isn't evident here. And it speaks to me as well about this idea of like digital literacy, in that, you know, people need to be trained on AI. Obviously, the public are using it at large now. And, you know, the public are putting themselves at risk if, you know, they don't understand the implications of just the basic settings, you know, whether or not their chats are shared publicly or set to private, so on. So
Yeah.
I think there's an awful lot to be done there. You know, it's not all about, you know, complex, you know, defense, you know, technical systems and measures and so on.
No.
Sometimes it's just the basics. You know, people can put themselves at risk if they just have a lack of understanding of the system.
Yeah, I do think there's two sides to it though, because on one side, like you say, it is that people aren't necessarily aware of how AI systems work, how to alter their settings. But then on the other hand, it's also that element of transparency and fairness, and that if you're providing or developing these systems, you need to make it clear to individuals what is going on, what data are we sharing, how can you manage your settings. You need to embed that sort of privacy by design, privacy by default, making sure that, you know, the default setting isn't that my personal conversations are being shared publicly for other people to see, because inevitably that's, you know, clearly that's unfair. But balancing both, allowing sort of transparency to inform users of how they can manage their privacy rights and their expectations.
Yeah, I think the transparency angle is really interesting. There are a couple of stories that I want to kind of touch on in that regard. You know, before moving on to those, I just want to make a point though that, you know, I'm having, you know, scenarios with my clients now where, you know, they want to use AI systems and so on for perfectly valid reasons. And there's just that big concern for me still that even if you can get assurances that, you know, the AI system has the right security measures in place, you know, the right standards and so on, and you get the assurance that your data isn't going to be used for training purposes, you know, you can have all of these assurances, I guess. But I think when you read stories like this Claude story, for me, there's still a lot of reluctance there around putting sensitive data into these systems, given that we don't fully understand how they work. And I think this is where this Claude story is an example of the wrong kind of transparency. You know, we don't want people's private information to be transparent, but we do want the AI system itself to be transparent, of course. And along these lines, we've had a couple of interesting cases. Again, there's one I want to touch on quickly, which relates to a Home Office asylum decision. Now, I believe it involved a Moroccan lady and her child who are basically fleeing a scenario of like forced underage marriage and extreme violence. And the claim for asylum was refused based on the supposed country policy information note, which claimed that Morocco was safe. Now, this has obviously ended up in front of you know, a senior judge in the upper tribunal, and they've basically come to the conclusion that this report seems to have been AI generated. They put it down to like an AI hallucination, which has produced this report that say Morocco is safe. When you look at the actual evidence, you know, Morocco isn't deemed safe, you know, in relation to the, you know, the issue of child marriages, for example, and, you know, the failure to sort of criminalize marital rape, for example. Yeah. So that's a massive concern.
It's a shocking case, to be honest. I think it particularly sort of like highlights the new jury updates and how they're so important, especially in relation to the updates to automated decision making, and that you sort of need meaningful human oversight when it comes to these automated means of somehow creating a report like that is clearly so harmful. Clearly, there's a lot of special category data involved in that case, and yet somehow no one's fact checked it at all. They've just completely relied on AI.
It seems to have been the case. Yeah, it seems to have been the case that whatever this AI system has claimed, it's just been accepted as the truth. basically, and obviously it's led to a very significant decision that someone that, should have been granted asylum was refused it. But I think along those lines of transparency as well, we've had the European Commission basically has put some guidelines out there now to assist providers and employers of AI systems to meet the AI Act's transparency obligations, which I believe just came into force or started to apply a couple of days ago on the 2nd of August. So again, these obligations seem, primarily geared towards making sure that people are aware of when they're interacting with AI-generated content, basically. So it's going to inform people whenever they're exposed to, deep fakes, AI-generated content or matters of public interest without human review and so on.
Yeah, I think it's when we're looking at these sorts of things, it just makes me feel like we definitely need to start looking towards having something like this in the UK, and particularly sort of looking at the EU AI Act and then all the guidance on top of that. I think it's really useful. I know sort of in the UK at the moment, the only thing we really have is basically a set of principles that just relate exactly back to the UK GDPR, and even that's not even getting anywhere near Parliament. So I think ultimately, for me anyway, I don't know how you feel, but I think we need to start looking towards having some framework in place.
I would say so, yeah, because I mean, my view is that, the GDPR standards, because they're based on principles, they are able to evolve, to new emerging technologies and so on, if principles remain true. And I think the EU AI Act, to my understanding, is structured in a similar way, and it's quite principles oriented. So I think it's just having that enforceable, body of law in place, isn't it? That we're lacking at the moment. And I think obviously from the UK perspective, maybe we're hoping that being a bit more, not having regulation in place essentially is going to, allow more innovation. Might allow us to get ahead in kind of the AI race, and the companies aren't going to be so restricted in terms of their research capabilities and abilities to leverage AI.
Yeah, whilst I do agree with that, I think the only difference is that whilst we have UK GDPR at the moment, it's hard to directly sort of apply the principles to AI. I think generally speaking, yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we want it to be fair, transparent, lawful, and so on. But I think then with what the EU AI Act proposes is this whole sort of risk framework, which I think is something really useful. So I suppose more than guidance, what we need is a more rigid sort of, if this AI system is in this risk category, then these are the things that are required. So, for example, conformity assessments, specific transparency obligations. I think a lot of the time it's not necessarily the what, it's the how, or the more detailed parts of things. So obviously we know if something's high risk, we want to complete a DPIA. But personally, whenever I've come across an AI system, I look at a DPIA and I think these aren't really asking the questions that I feel like need to be asked. And unless you're clued up on AI or you've got a lot of experience in that area, you might not know where to look or what questions to ask yourself to sort of evaluate the risk level of this system, let alone what to do to mitigate that. I think you have to sort of be a very technical expert in the area to sort of be able to identify these things and mitigate them. And obviously you can't expect all consultants to be experts in AI because it's impossible. We can't be experts in every area we look into.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point in that, take the DPIA, for example. Obviously, I think applied to AI, it can account for a lot of the risks from personal data point of view.
Yeah.
As you're saying, the risks with AI, are broader than that, aren't they? They go beyond that.
Yeah.
And I do think it would make sense for us to have, similar frameworks to what the EU has in terms of being able to just categorize the system so that we know what we're most concerned with, and where we do want to have more scrutiny over AI and where we're less concerned. I think it would clarify the situation for a lot of companies that are obviously increasingly looking to use AI.
Yeah.
And I think as well, I mean, the other thing I'd say on the, I saw an interesting point around the EU AI Act it was basically talking about its effectiveness in actually regulating and combating the risks of AI, given that obviously a lot of the major AI systems and developments are US or Chinese owned. So it raises that issue of jurisdiction again, doesn't it? And the EU AI Act does give, some pretty significant regulatory powers, really. I believe that, non-compliance, can be met with, a fine of up to 3% global turnover, for example. So again, it's quite a significant power. But again, as we see with GDPR, it's raising the question of, well, what's going to be the ability for them to actually enforce on that, given the jurisdictional implications?
I mean, ultimately, a lot of these sort of US systems or AI systems are offering goods and services in the UK and the EU, and therefore they are subject to EU GDPR, UK GDPR. It falls within the territorial scope. So, I mean, there's no reason they shouldn't comply. I think at the moment we just don't really have an awful amount in place to subject them to. So they could be compliant with UK GDPR, but because it's so malleable at the moment in relation to AI specifically, I think there's no real set standard to hold them against. And whilst I fully obviously believe that UK GDPR should remain applicable to the use of AI in the UK, I think we ultimately need something appended to that, similar to the PEPA, obviously AI specific. We need to append something to that is more specific and clear in relation to AI. Although I do sort of appreciate your comment that at the same time it needs to be flexible enough to allow for innovation, to allow for growth, especially given sort of the growth of AI and technology is exponential. We need to keep on top of that and allow for room to grow. But I think we do, at this stage, I think we need to start looking towards having a more clear structure and also making it more enforceable for those US companies, because I think they tend to be the ones that sort of fall out of line.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you on the territorial scope. By rights, they should be compliant. I think the enforcement scenario can still be challenging, basically.
Yeah.
But then again, another link which I've made here is around all the discourse around, and I appreciate we're going to sort of step back into data protection here. But again, I think the same principle, again, still applies given we're talking about the Article 3 territorial scope. Around the interplay between data protection and competition, I believe the EDPB and the European Commission are looking to basically have a bit of a sort of stakeholder event and get heads together on this, and maybe look at coming up with some kind of joint guidelines on it, on how that interplay works, I suppose. Because I think there's a lot to this, because as we've just spoke about there, let's say even if a company, let's say it's based in the US, were to try and evade a GDPR sanction, let's say, or EU AI Act sanction, it's not going to be very good for their reputation, is it? Necessarily. No. It's going to do a lot of reputational damage. And I think we're probably in an age now where I think privacy and data protection and, compliance with, all the requisite standards is almost a way in which companies are, especially technology companies, are actually competing against each other now. They're almost trying to one-up each other in the arena of, DP privacy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that we were saying about this before, it depends on the sector, but not only that, it depends whether it's private or public. Because ultimately, if you're in the public sector, you kind of don't really have to worry about that competitive element. You can focus more inward on your data protection policies and so on, and being more compliant tends to be sort of your competitive element. But in the private sector, I've had clients before who have said, well, this other organization that's similar to mine isn't doing this. And, this is a barrier for me if I start implementing, for example, the children's code. If I start putting restrictions on my website, asking people's age, verifying kids' age and blocking out, under 13s or so on, then I'm going to lose business, which is completely understandable. And you sort of then, that's when risk appetite comes in. And people start weighing up, is it worth the risk? A potential fine that may never come because arguably the ICO aren't always on top of it.
Yeah.
Or
I think it's a great point to make, because that does seem to be the consensus view, doesn't it? Is that data protection is seen as this kind of hindrance to growth. I think that was probably at the heart of a lot of the do-up days, wasn't it? That we want to make things laxer, we want to make it easier for companies to innovate with data and so on, without worrying about GDPR sanctions and so on. So, but again, I think there's both elements to it, I suppose, and I fully back up your point as well on the public sector, in that we do see a lot of really bad breaches, within the public sector, and I suspect that compared to the private sector, I would say. And I think maybe one of the reasons for that, as we touched on there, is because within the private sector, there's that competition pressure, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's real consequences there to the business, to the reputation of the business, if they don't get it right. Whereas if you're a government body, you're essentially a de facto monopoly, aren't you, over that function? You are the government body for education, for example. you're not having that pressure necessarily.
I suppose it comes down to funding as well, doesn't it, arguably?
Funding's
I
a
don't
big
want to get
factor.
into that.
Yeah, no, funding's a big factor as well, definitely. And I suppose, as we've seen with the cost of AI report that we touched on earlier, those costs are only going up, basically. So, yeah, and I suspect that's going to, continue to be the case. But at the same time, we talk about, AI there and, very sort of complex dynamics around competition and data protection and so on. And I do think, we're increasingly talking about the, emerging risks, aren't we, around AI technology and so on. But I think some of the stories that also, kind of stood out to me over the last week or so are actually around scenarios that, are almost a bit of a throwback, really.
Yeah.
There was one story around West Sussex County Council, I believe, that an urban explorer basically managed to get into one of their old disused offices. And within that office were a lot of unsecured paper files, basically. I think there's some pretty relatively sensitive stuff in there. Probably came across, hundreds of confidential records, blue badges, application forms, court paperwork, names, addresses, even foster care files.
Yeah, I think with the rise of sort of like AI and everything, so I keep using that word like it's a buzzword. But I suppose with the development of technology and how everything's going, I think we often forget that there's still organisations in the process of digitization. And even myself, sometimes I forget, ask about what they've got paper file wise. And we sort of forget that falls under the scope of GDPR still, and it still needs to be maintained. It's not just what you've got online and in your sort of cloud systems or in your local drive on a computer. It matters, obviously, your archives and paper files, where they're stored, how they're kept secure.
Yeah, because it's a massive risk, right? Isn't it? You may get it all right in terms of your, technical measures, your digital systems and so on. But if you've got a, big office building, it's easily accessible, if you wanted to get in there. And within that building is, hundreds of sensitive paper records. That's just as big of a problem as if there was a hole in your digital system, right?
Yeah, it's all about balance, isn't it? And it kind of links back to the whole training element that we were speaking about earlier, and that it's almost like the basic training we're missing now. We've sort of jumped ahead and we're training people on how to avoid sort of like social engineering attacks, but we're not looking at, basically lock up your paper files, which is sort of step one of data protection. Well, I suppose it was maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah. It's just moved on so fast, hasn't it? It just makes me think that, it's a very interesting area we work in, really, and that we are expected to be up to date, to be following the developments, technologically speaking. But at the same time, you can easily be pulled into a scenario that involves paper records and securing those. I've had that quite a lot myself. And with the same client, the same client wants to use AI and so on. The same one that also wants to secure its paper records and so on. So,
and there's no retention periods on them at all. They've had them for 50 years. And
in some cases, yeah, in some cases, I think, it does make our work very interesting. But I think the other thing that we haven't, I suppose, touched on, we've spoken about, hackers from the outside. We've spoken about employees making mistakes. Obviously, another way in which, breaches can happen, or, misuse of personal data can occur is from rogue employees, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a worker at Hertfordshire Council, basically. He's been found guilty of unlawfully accessing hundreds of personal records. He's actually received a suspended prison sentence for it. And I believe that in terms of the data that he was unlawfully accessing, I believe it was approximately 490 records. He's actually downloaded 94 documents that related to his family members and acquaintances. And this was highly sensitive information, medical records, social worker reports, child and family assessments. So again, you can do everything right. You can train the employee, you can secure your system from the, to stop people from the outside getting in, but it might just be you have someone rogue on the inside.
Yeah, and it kind of links to that story. I'm sure a lot of people have seen a story that popped up in the news a few weeks ago about an administrative staff member at HMP Moorland. So essentially, this employee accessed a lot of information about prisoner George Tunney. It ended up later being shared to Tunney's phone. So she was jailed after admitting misconduct, obviously unauthorised access to data. But essentially, A friend of hers or a former colleague had a personal relationship with that inmate, and had asked her to share his confidential email about him. And yeah, she'd accessed his records alongside a lot of other sort of notorious criminals, which, yeah, alongside Lucy Letby, Howard Shipman, and Rose West, which is, I'm a nosy person.
She's obviously very, very, very curious. And she's actually been sentenced to jail then.
Yeah.
For this.
Yeah. I think for 18 months, or 21 months, sorry.
And it wasn't suspended or anything, I take it. It doesn't look like it from that report. Yeah, again, and I think that's absolutely fair enough. I think maybe someone doesn't know data protection. They might not even know they're actually committing an offence in doing this.
No, she was only 23 as well, which I think clearly this is sort of one of those cases where it's sort of been used as to set a precedent, but I do think it is quite harsh. I appreciate, obviously, it is a breach. It is sort of a bit negligent in terms of you should know better, but at some stage you sort of have to think, there's much bigger things going on. For example, that data breach we spoke about at the beginning with the Ministry of Defence. And it's weird to see how in some cases it's sort of just overlooked. And then in cases like this, it seems to be much bigger.
I mean, it makes you wonder though, doesn't it, in terms of, could training have been an issue in this case that you're talking about? Presumably you'd like to think that you would have had some sort of data protection training. There would have been, a code of conduct there and so on, data protection policies that would have made it clear that, this is an offence, by the way, to access, personal records without authorization.
Yeah.
So that maybe training is the piece that kind of connects the two.
Yeah, the lack of awareness, isn't it? Like, I know we spoke about a case as well where a teenager was fined £700 for leaking a football's referee address.
Yes, I saw this one actually. Yeah, because I believe it related to the referee from I think it was Celtic against Motherwell. And there was like controversial, I don't want to make this about football, but basically it was a controversial decision made and it kind of helped to swing the title race up in Scotland. And obviously this guy, I believe, the individual liable at fault was, I think, was he a car mechanic? And I think the referee's partner brought a car in and he's obviously done some sort of check on her, ID check or something, got like an ID card.
Yeah.
Sussed out that, it's that referee's, partner.
Yeah.
And he's taken a photo of the record.
On Snapchat.
There we go, yeah.
Yeah. And he's only 19 years old, I suppose. Obviously, as being a youngerish person, I'm on Snapchat. I see a lot of things that are sort of similar to that. And I can appreciate how it may be a lack of awareness, but I think then that's something we really need to sort of focus on. Or even Snapchat itself, platforms like that are aware that younger users may be using it unintentionally for sort of purposes when there may be a breach of information. I think it's really important to sort of reinforce that among younger individuals who are very social media oriented, who maybe do post a lot and, want to share things with their friends, but don't realise, for example, that if I post a picture of my laptop screen when I'm working from home, that's actually an issue. That's not, that's such an leak data.
Completely agree. I mean, you wonder what training he would have had, I suppose. I mean, I'm surprised that, he's not had a worse punishment in a way, because I think in this case, I think there's a direct link between him obviously sharing this referee's address and almost in a way that's almost egging on some, harm or, to come to that referee, and in like quite a direct way. I believe he did lose his job over the incident, so I'm guessing that's why.
Yeah, it's quite a harsh punishment. I suppose it depends, doesn't it? It depends on the element of risk and how likely harm would have been to that individual because of his actions. Arguably, he could have had 5 friends on Snapchat. So I think it does depend, but I do get your point. It seems sort of almost disproportionate in some instances, the sort of penalties and fines and things that happen to some individuals who cause a breach compared to others. But
I mean, I think the court in that case had probably decided that because, he'd already lost his job, basically, such a, bad outcome, I suppose, that maybe it didn't feel right for him to impose, a prison sentence or whatever off the back of that. But I just wanted to touch on another big theme as well, which I saw, which again is moving back to the AI here. But I realised that, the MOD breach, the DFE breach, and these other breaches we've spoken about here are also in the exposure of personal data. Now, there's been some new research by a company, Gartner. They've actually predicted that by 2029, so, not far away at all, 3 years' time, most data protection incidents are going to come from AI-generated inferences rather than direct exposure of personal data. And what we're talking to here basically is the use of, again, generative AI, and, machine learning to extract sensitive attributes and so on from aggregated or anonymized data.
Yeah, that's actually really scary, isn't it? Particularly, we're not only looking at AI now, but we're also looking at inferred, potentially special category data, which I think, for me, that sort of touches on a very sort of special interest of mine when it comes to data protection. Because I know you sort of know that I wrote my dissertation on sort of special category data and political campaigns. I think for me, it's a lot of people probably see this and think, oh, it doesn't really matter, like if I can tell what AI is being used, obviously that's not real cat dancing and so on. And it's funny in some elements, but then when you sort of look deeper into things, it has a much broader impact, because if special category data is being inferred and it is then being used to spread disinformation or malinformation, you start to worry about how that might affect, for example, our political campaigns.
Sure.
Like how things are being marketed to us. Are they sort of using my data to infer what political party I may vote for? And is that sort of then a marginal vote? And I think a lot of us recently, to me anyway, not to get too political, but I think it's clear that this is a really big factor, because a lot of the time we're sort of voting for things and then we're going, oh, hold on, now that this is enforced, this isn't what I agreed to,
Sure.
this isn't what I wanted, or this isn't what was said. And there is already a lot of fake news, let alone with AI spurring that on.
Yeah, it's kind of fueling it, isn't it? In a sense, yeah. It's making the kind of political landscape more divided, isn't it? And I guess toxic in a sense. It certainly doesn't seem to be making a positive impact there. And I mean, interestingly, in terms of what Gartner have recommended in terms of how this risk of kind of data inference is going to be combated, they basically recommended, embedding AI governance, into data protection operations. So privacy by design principles, privacy enhancing technologies, and so on. And obviously having a big focus on data minimization, basically. But I think it also leads and links to another story that we looked at, where Google was forced to basically share anonymized data sets with some of its search engine rivals. That's what it just makes you think we're seeing this more and more. We spoke about on the podcast a while ago, I think Lloyds Bank sold a load of anonymized data, anonymized customer data is a way of making money. But obviously what this story is kind of telling us is that, well, hold on a minute. AI, is very, very capable, by the way.
Yeah.
You may think you've anonymized that data set. AI, essentially, maybe not now, some point in the future, might be able to start filling in the gaps.
With these inferences, for sure, you wonder if that is a possibility, whether sort of the current definition of anonymization will still stand in 5 years' time, because ultimately it's going to get far more easier to re-identify people. I think even now there's still, I come across a lot of issues with my clients where they may believe something's anonymized, but they have the key, or there's some element of re-identification, and in actuality it is just pseudonymized. But I think there's already a sort of an awareness of what anonymization really is. So I'm kind of worried, but also excited to see where it goes in terms of how that evolves, because I think now we're sort of already struggling to identify where things are truly anonymized. But maybe that's something that will be covered by GDPR in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
Anonymized data will fall under the scope.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe to some extent, it could even tie into what we're seeing in terms of the EU digital omnibus proposals, where of course we're looking at, kind of essentially watering down some of the key provisions of the definition of personal data is obviously one of the big ones. And, again, I think that proposal generally is kind of hoping to open things up a little bit for businesses so they can do more with data, they can be more innovative, maybe take a few more risks, without further repercussion. But it's a big worry, isn't it, that, essentially our protections are being watered down at a time when the landscape, it's a personal data processing, arguably it's never been more high risk.
I think this just goes to show that the current legislation doesn't fit. I think it fits in so many ways in terms of principles, but we need more specifics that are tailored towards AI use. Particularly, for example, if you look at processes and due diligence, Article 28, when it comes to AI, you look through how many processes an AI system uses and wow, like you'd be so surprised. There's so much thousands. In that instance, how do you expect realistically for that to work? Like due diligence on every single one of those processes, making sure all the Article 28 safeguards and conditions are within the DPAs. I think you sort of, although I understand why these are needed and I think they're so important, we almost need to meet in the middle and find a way that is workable for AI solutions so that we're not going one way or the other. We're not doing way too much and making it unrealistic for AI systems, but we're also not completely sidelining that process as well.
Sure, yeah, it's kind of that balance, isn't it, between we want the AI to develop, of course,
Yeah.
and we want it to be more efficient and better at what, things we want it to do, but at the same time, we want it to be, compliant with all the obligations and so on. I think this, for me, a good kind of, scenario that kind of encapsulates this dynamic within AI is the explainability versus accuracy conundrum. Because I've heard it said a lot, and I've spoken to a guy that's doing a PhD over in the States on AI, and I was asking about this. I was saying, is it a legitimate kind of concern, the explainability versus accuracy thing? Because basically, it's this thing whereby AI, obviously, for all intents and purposes, a lot of it remains a black box. So we don't really know what's going on inside it. We know it can produce certain outcomes, but we don't know all the steps that it's taken to reach that outcome. It's not very explainable, obviously not very transparent.
Yeah, and it is difficult, isn't it? Because I suppose once you understand AI, you'll know that it sort of works like a human brain and that it has all these neural networks. So in order for it to produce more accurate, sophisticated outcomes, it does rely on a lot more steps, a lot more algorithms. The algorithms are way more advanced. And I feel like, a lot of people don't know how they work in themselves. I suppose once AI systems start running on themselves as well, or if they already are, then, there's even less transparency about what's going on because it's sort of doing it all internally. So I think, like you say, it's about balance, and that we need to sort of have some metric or some framework on how we can accurately and fairly sort of delineate what these AI systems are doing for the transparency element, but also making it clear and understandable, because that's another element of transparency. It needs to be intelligible for users. So, outlining all these steps, it is unrealistic.
Because, it's hard for the AI engineers and experts in the area to understand, so how are we going to get that into a format where it's understandable to, the average person?
Yeah, exactly.
I think it leaves a massive challenge. I think what you said there about balance is going to be key, though. It's about maybe accepting that the accuracy might not quite be as high as it could be, or as what we would like it to be, but we accept that maybe as a trade-off because we want to ensure explainability. We want to ensure that we understand what it's doing.
Yeah.
So I guess it is a real conundrum there. But I wanted to move on to a couple of stories that you picked up on, sort of round us off on AI. And I think we'll just finish up by mentioning an ICO good news story. I think if we just talk about this one that you picked up on here about the arrival of AI-enabled smart lampposts.
Yeah, no, this is a really scary news story that I've seen recently. And essentially, CPG, or Conflow Power Group in Warwickshire, has essentially signed an agreement with the government of Katsina, which is in Nigeria, to supply them with 50,000 eye lamps. So basically, these eye lamps, they use obviously cameras to enforce traffic laws, to look at vehicles, but also for facial recognition. So Edward Fitzpatrick basically said that these could track down missing persons or fight crime. However, apparently these will only be developed in partnership with the relevant authority, but still you sort of start to think about function creep and whether that will be limited to just that use. So these cameras can detect parking violations, speeding vehicles, and even not wearing seatbelts. So yeah, I think it's really worrying, actually. So eventually the revenue from these sort of fines for speeding and traffic violations will be used to fund the continuation of this project.
I think they make enough money off the parking and traffic fine. We just talked about that before coming onto the pod. But and I mean, that for me is a massive concern. You just wonder if it's technology going too far, essentially.
Yeah, and whilst it seems so far away, I mean, they're currently being built in Morocco, Taiwan, and Latvia. So it's, I can't imagine it'll be long before maybe we start seeing these eye lamps. Particularly sort of reflecting on what Shabana Mahmood revealed. So she sort of said that she wanted this sort of panopticon state, which, if you've ever seen 1984, it is essentially that. I feel like I mention this every week and every podcast I do, but it's my favourite book. But she sort of said, we're already rolling out live facial recognition technology, but she thinks there's big space here to be able to harness the power of AI and to get ahead of criminals. which is what we're trying to do. So she just sort of assert that it's more for people that are criminals. So if you commit a crime, then you sacrifice the right to that kind of liberty, is what she says.
Yeah, it's a point you often hear made, isn't it? I mean, it takes me back to the point of what surveillance actually is and what it entails, though, because I've always liked the line of, you behave differently when you're being watched.
Yeah.
So technically, even if you're not doing anything wrong per se, you'll be punished. But it's the fact you're being watched, and that's going to have an impact on you. And and that shouldn't even be a scenario.
No, it's almost like scaremongering, isn't it? It's very authoritarian. It's very Big Brother. Perhaps you said it lightly, I'm not sure, but I think even the idea of that is quite worrying, especially given sort of the recent advancements in terms of, having a cashless state in itself. That's already sort of edging that way. When we start putting eye lamps on the streets and watching people through cameras, I think that's when you start worrying, really. But I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose in theory, this is what our sort of data protection and, privacy laws, our right to privacy should be there to push back against, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I suppose that does make it even more worrying if the talk is that, we're going to have less rights, potentially under, reformed, data protection law in the future.
Yeah.
I just wanted to finish off though on this good news story, as I kind of alluded it to, around the ICO. Obviously, there's been a lot of, negativity around the ICO of late, but I think they do come up in a particularly good light here. It's been some robust enforcement action. Do you want to just run us through this one?
Yeah, of course. So basically, there's been a lot of nuisance marketing going on related to like car finance mis-selling claims. So the ICO have executed search warrants across the UK to combat this. So they received more than 12 million complaints about nuisance marketing text messages. So
I was shocked at that number.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's since September of last year. So that's up to 100,000 a day. So they're working alongside the FCA, the ASA and the SRA to tackle basically the poor handling of motor finance claims connected sort of this mis-selling scheme. So these were carried out on the 29th of July. So just last week, targeting a mix of residential and business premises linked to 5 companies across Bolton, Burnley, Liverpool, London and Swansea. So these companies are responsible for sending combined 117 million text messages, between September last year and May this year.
Wow. That's a lot of messages being sent, isn't it? And as I say, a lot of complaints. Good to see the kind of regulatory cooperation coming in there with those other regulators. And one other thing that I know that I think Andy Curry remarked on was that those searches, the use of these search warrants and so on, obviously sending a clear message to that claims management sector.
Yeah, comply with the law or expect to hear from us. That's what he says.
Well, I think that's a better message, isn't it? I think than perhaps what the ITO might have been accused of in the last few years, where, as we said about the MOD breach, widely held belief is that obviously not enough scrutiny was had, not enough was done.
Yeah.
But I think this one, I think it's fair to give credit where it's due and to highlight, where, some more robust action has been taken.
Yeah, particularly in relation to PECA as well. I think it's nice to see more being carried out in terms of compliance with PECA and direct marketing. And I think it kind of links back to the element we spoke about earlier in terms of competition and how, particularly maybe in these industries, people may feel sort of less obliged, or organisations, should I say, may feel less obliged to sort of comply with these regulations because they feel that it hinders their competitive element, and particularly because this is related to direct marketing. I think at this extent, you kind of have to think, they must have been neglecting their obligations. I would struggle to believe they were unaware, but perhaps.
Sure. Yeah.
And they've clearly gone, well, benefit versus sort of risk.
Yeah.
Do we get more out of sending people these really annoying text messages, which I think I've received a few, to be honest, but never complained. Should have.
Yeah, I think even I've received, to be honest. Yeah, I've never had anything, to do with this, with the scandal. It just goes to show. But no, I think it's a great link there. I think you were obviously telling me that obviously this market, the claims management so on is very, very saturated, and they, I find it hard to believe as well that they would have been completely unaware of that. But they've obviously decided that, they obviously made the decision that the risk was worth the reward. I think given that they're in this much trouble with the ICO, seemingly not.
and the picture of all the telephones. They searched all the premises. They've taken away mobile phones, laptops, SIM cards. I think, yeah, the picture was, I thought, unbelievable. I think I showed you so many telephones.
Yes.
But I think it's quite interesting to see this sort of form of redress or action taken, because generally it's just, you get a pat on the hand with a warning. But I also think that the approach should be uniform, because I think, sort of across all the different approaches we've seen within these cases, there's been a very different approach to where they've decided to sort of carry out some form of investigation or, pursue a breach, for example. And then this, it seems almost, to me anyway, it seems very unbalanced in terms of when and how they decide to take action.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a fair comment to make. Obviously, they have their own priorities and so on.
Yeah.
Which are obviously kind of expanding now by law under the DUA and obviously the new Information Commission and so on. But yeah, as I say, nice to round off on that one as a good news story for the ICO. So yeah.
So take away how you after this session, maybe.
Yeah, lots and lots. Yeah. So yeah, we'll keep our ear to the grapevine, so to speak, to see what else comes through. Yeah, and we look forward to presenting some more GDPR radio to you in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.